My family thought I was just a frail old woman they could exclude from Mother's Day, and I overheard my daughter-in-law call me a burden. They lied, telling me they were staying home for a quiet day, just to hide me from their fancy friends at the most exclusive restaurant in town. But they had no idea I owned that very restaurant, and I used a single clause in their lease to deliver the most satisfying and permanent revenge imaginable. The Friday before Mother's Day started with a visit. My son Mark and his wife Alyssa stopped by in the afternoon, a whirlwind of suburban energy in my quiet Brookline home. Alyssa was the very picture of forced cheerfulness, handing me a small, perfect white orchid in a ceramic pot. Her smile was bright, but it was a brittle thing, something that didn't quite reach her eyes, as she spoke effusively about how I deserved a quiet, restful weekend. Her gaze swept over my living room, my late husband Frank's favorite armchair, the dark wood bookshelves filled with actual books, instead of curated objects, the worn spot on the oriental rug. It was the look of an appraiser, someone cataloging the ways my comfortable, lived-in world failed to meet some unspoken standard. The little orchid felt less like a gift and more like a prop in a play I hadn't been given the script for. Then came the performance. Alyssa placed a cool, manicured hand on my arm, her touch meant to convey sincerity. She told me they had decided to just have a quiet day at home on Sunday, just the four of them. She explained that those trendy brunch places were so dreadfully loud and crowded, a real sensory overload. She was thinking of me, she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. They didn't want to overwhelm me. Every word was perfectly placed, a little brick in the wall she was building around me. It was a masterpiece of condescension disguised as care. I was being managed, handled with the gentle, patronizing air one reserves for the very frail or the very simple. I just nodded, a quiet ache starting to bloom in my chest. I knew my son and I could see him shifting his weight by the door, uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict the narrative his wife was spinning. Mark went into the kitchen to get me a glass of water, a small act of escape. In his absence, Alyssa's phone, which she'd placed face up on the coffee table, lit up. It was just a flicker, a brief illumination in the soft afternoon light. My eyes, without meaning to, caught the words on the screen. It was a text message from a friend of hers named Chloe. The question was simple enough: is your MIL coming to brunch Sunday? But it was the reply, the one Alyssa had typed out but not yet sent, that made the air go thin in my lungs. I could see it clearly in the preview bubble. God, no. Can't have that kind of burden at Le Ciel. Just telling her we're having a day at home. The word burden landed with a physical force. It echoed in the sudden roaring silence of my mind. Burden. For a moment, all I could feel was the sharp, clean sting of it. The lie about having a quiet day at home was one thing. That was a social nicety, a coward's excuse. But this was the truth laid bare on a tiny, glowing screen. And the mention of Le Ciel, Brookline's newest, most obnoxiously chic and expensive restaurant, was the final clarifying piece. This wasn't about my comfort. It wasn't about noise or crowds. It was about image. I was a social liability, a relic, a burden to be hidden away so as not to spoil the perfect Instagrammable picture of their perfect life. The quiet pain that had been blooming in my chest turned into a shard of ice. But then, a strange thing happened. The ice didn't shatter me. It spread, freezing the hurt, turning it into something hard and solid. Something cold and clear and utterly resolute. Mark came back into the room with the water, oblivious. I took it from him, my hand perfectly steady, and I smiled. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I slept surprisingly well that Friday night. The hurt hadn't vanished, but the cold resolve that replaced it was like a sturdy backbone. It held me upright. On Saturday morning, I waited. I knew their schedule by heart, the frantic rush to get the kids to their 10 a.m. soccer game. I gave them until 10:30, picturing them on the sidelines, distracted, a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other. Then I made my first move. I called Mark's cell. My voice when I spoke was calm, even pleasantly inquisitive. I told him I had a quick question, that I'd been sorting through his father's old office, a plausible excuse, and had found some letterhead for a company I didn't recognize. I asked him if the name Beacon Hill Commercial Properties rang a bell. The reaction was immediate and telling. On the other end of the line, I heard the faint shouts from the soccer field, and then Mark's stammer. He fumbled, saying something about how he thought his dad had mentioned it once, that it was some small thing he'd dissolved years ago. He was a terrible liar, my son. Before he could trip over his own words any further, the call was hijacked. Alyssa's sharp, clear voice cut in, leaving no room for doubt that she had snatched the phone. She told me Mark was right, that it was just one of Frank's old investment hobbies, and it hadn't been active in years. She finished by telling me with that same infuriatingly sweet tone from yesterday that I honestly shouldn't be worrying my head with old paperwork. Her speed, her perfect, seamless dismissal, it was more revealing than any confession. They weren't just lying. They were coordinating. That was all the confirmation I needed. The moment I hung up, my fingers were dialing a new number, one I knew by heart. Mr. Davies had been Frank's estate lawyer, but more than that, he'd been our friend for over 40 years. When his secretary put me through, I kept my voice light. I explained that I had a few financial questions I was hoping he could clear up for me, and asked if he might have a moment on Monday. He told me to come in first thing. Just like that, I had an ally. I had a plan. The cold resolve inside me felt less like a defense and more like a weapon being sharpened. Less than an hour later, my doorbell rang. A delivery van was parked at the curb, and a young man was wrestling a ridiculously large bouquet out of the back. It was an explosion of lilies and roses, an ostentatious funereal display so large it barely fit through my front door. The card was tucked into the greenery, Alyssa's perfect, looping script, wishing me a relaxing weekend and telling me to let them spoil me. I recognized the move instantly. This wasn't a gift. This was an overcorrection. It was a thinly veiled attempt to smother my suspicions with a gesture of performative affection. The cloying, heavy scent of the lilies began to fill the house, an oppressive sweetness that felt less like a kindness and more like a warning. On Mother's Day morning, the house was still thick with the cloying scent of lilies. It was a constant floral reminder of Alyssa's panicked attempt at control. My own move had to be the opposite: quiet, understated, and completely disarming. I waited until late morning, around the time I knew they'd be settling in for their brunch. I picked up my phone and sent a single, simple text message to Mark. I told him the flowers were lovely and that I hoped he, Alyssa, and the children were having a wonderful day together. Every word was a carefully chosen lie, a piece of camouflage. By feigning quiet contentment, I was allowing them to believe their deception had worked. The burden had been successfully managed, and they could enjoy their public performance without a flicker of guilt. I could picture the scene at Le Ciel perfectly. The sun-drenched patio, the clinking of glasses, the parade of designer sunglasses and weekend leisure wear. Alyssa would be in her element, directing my son and grandchildren for the perfect Instagram photo. I could almost see her angling the phone to get the artisan French toast and the mimosas in the same pristine shot. I imagined her leaning over to Mark, showing him my text on her screen, a relieved little whisper escaping her lips. She would tell him she knew it was the right call, that I was perfectly happy at home. Then she'd turn to a friend at an adjacent table, another woman in the same social uniform, and complain subtly about the constant pressure of managing extended family. She would frame herself as the dutiful, stressed daughter-in-law, a martyr to the demands of the older generation. It wasn't a family celebration. It was a stage, and she was the star of the show. While Alyssa was curating her public image, I was in my husband's private office. I wasn't resting or feeling sorry for myself. I was preparing for war. The room was just as Frank had left it, organized and quiet. I methodically pulled every file, every tax return, and every old bank statement I could find related to Beacon Hill Commercial Properties. The name that had caused such a flustered reaction on the phone yesterday was now the singular focus of my attention. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I knew the truth was somewhere in that crisp old paper. I sorted everything by date, creating a neat, ordered pile on the corner of his mahogany desk, ready for my meeting with Mr. Davies tomorrow. That evening, the final insult arrived not via a delivery van, but through the cold glow of a screen. Mark, perhaps nudged by a guilty conscience that needed a public outlet, posted a gushing tribute on Facebook. It featured a professionally perfect sun-kissed photo from their brunch at Le Ciel. The caption was a love letter to his incredible wife, Alyssa, the most amazing mother in the world. He tagged the restaurant and he tagged a dozen of their smiling, successful friends. He did not mention his own mother. It was a public erasure, a careless, thoughtless, and complete removal of my existence from his celebration of family. Any lingering whisper of doubt, any soft-hearted hesitation I might have had, evaporated in that moment. They had made their decision. Now it was time for me to make mine. Monday morning felt like the first day of the rest of my life. I walked into Mr. Davies' downtown office, the neat stack of Frank's files, feeling heavy in my tote bag. The office was a world of quiet power, mahogany desk, leather chairs, the hushed ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Mr. Davies, a kind man with sharp eyes, greeted me warmly and took the files. He spent a long time looking through them, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, the silence in the room stretching thin. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He told me that my husband, Frank, was a much shrewder man than he ever let on. He explained that Beacon Hill Commercial Properties wasn't a hobby. It was a limited liability company, an LLC, that Frank had set up decades ago. And it owned the deeds to 12 prime commercial lots in the greater Boston area. As Frank's sole heir, he informed me I was now the owner of all of them. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in before delivering the final stunning blow. He said that this portfolio included the building at 1452 Beacon Street, which he noted with a twinkle in his eye, currently housed a very popular restaurant called Le Ciel. That evening, I called Mark and Alyssa and told them to come over, that it was an urgent family matter. They arrived looking concerned, probably assuming it was a health issue. I had them sit on the sofa, and I placed the file from Mr. Davies on the coffee table between us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture them. I simply reached into the folder, pulled out a single document, and slid it across the table toward them. It was the deed of ownership for 1452 Beacon Street. Mark stared at it, his mouth slightly open, speechless. Alyssa's face, however, drained of all color. Her carefully constructed composure shattered in an instant. She blurted out that it was just brunch, her voice cracking. And then the confession poured out of her, a raw, pathetic torrent of social desperation. She told me I didn't understand the pressure, the constant competition she was under. At her firm, at the kids' school, with her friends, everything had to be perfect. Having me there with my stories and what she called my old-fashioned ways wasn't the image they needed to project. She said it would have been a disaster. For the first time, I saw past the cruelty to the terrified, insecure woman beneath it all. The raw honesty of her breakdown seemed to shock Mark more than the deed itself. He looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, not as a monster, but as someone consumed by a deep, hollow insecurity that he himself had enabled for years. He whispered her name full of shame, and then looked at me and said that I was his mother. In that moment, the united front of their marriage, the perfect team they presented to the world, crumbled into a pile of blame and shame right there on my living room rug. I remained perfectly calm. I let the silence hang for a moment, then reached out and gently retrieved the deed, placing it back in the folder. I looked at Alyssa not with anger, but with a kind of sad clarity. I thanked her for being so honest. I told her that her explanation had given me perfect clarity on how to handle the restaurant's upcoming lease renewal. Then I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. We had nothing more to discuss that night. I didn't have to raise my voice or issue a single threat. I simply dismissed them. They walked out of my house powerless, with no idea what consequences were coming, only that for the first time in a very long time, I was the one who was completely in control. I let 3 weeks of silence pass. It was a heavy, anxious silence on their end, I'm sure. But for me, it was a time of quiet, methodical work. I met with Mr. Davies and with Janet, the manager of Le Ciel. Janet was a sharp, professional woman in her 50s who I could tell had dealt with her fair share of entitled patrons like my daughter-in-law. When I explained my position as the new owner and laid out my terms for the lease renewal, she didn't bat an eye. She simply nodded, a flicker of understanding in her gaze. We drew up the new lease, precise and ironclad. Then I waited. I knew Alyssa wouldn't be able to stand the uncertainty. Her entire identity was built on projecting an image of effortless success, and my quiet control was a direct threat to that. Sooner or later, she would have to make a grand gesture to prove to her social circle and to herself that she was still on top. And just as I predicted, she did. With Mark's 45th birthday approaching, she decided to throw him a lavish party. The only venue that would suffice, of course, was her personal stage, the patio at Le Ciel. Janet called me later that afternoon to tell me how it went. She said Alyssa had called, her voice full of the friendly condescension she reserved for people she considered staff. She wanted to book the entire patio for the 28th. Janet's tone, however, was different this time. She was impeccably polite, but with a cool, professional distance Alyssa would not have been used to. She informed Alyssa that unfortunately she wouldn't be able to accommodate the request to book the patio for that date. Janet said Alyssa scoffed, telling her they were her best customers and that she should find a way to make it happen. This was the moment. The judgment wasn't delivered with a shout, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of a legal contract. Janet calmly explained that it simply wasn't possible. She mentioned that, as Alyssa might know, the building had recently changed ownership, and their new lease contained a very specific, non-negotiable addendum. Clause 14b. Janet told me she paused for a moment, as if rustling the paper before she read it aloud. She recited the clause verbatim, explaining that it stated that members of the Moore family, specifically Mr. Mark and Mrs. Alyssa Moore, and their direct descendants, while welcome to dine as regular patrons, were hereby prohibited from making large party reservations or booking any private functions without the prior written notarized consent of the property owner, Mrs. Patricia Moore, for each specific event. Janet said a long, heavy silence hung on the line. The humiliation was absolute, but it was also devastatingly precise. I hadn't destroyed a business. I hadn't started a screaming match or aired our dirty laundry in public. I had simply used the very instrument of Alyssa's social ambition, the exclusive restaurant, and turned it into a permanent, legally binding monument to her disrespect. She had been blocked not by a person's whim, but by a contract. Her social climbing had hit a legal wall that I had quietly built. Janet let the silence stretch for a few more seconds before clearing her throat and asking her final, perfectly courteous question. She asked Alyssa if instead of the party, she would be wanting to make a standard reservation for two. And in response, there was only the soft click of a phone being hung up. Defeated. The aftermath was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, slow unraveling. I heard whispers, of course, through the old Brookline social circles that Alyssa coveted, but I had been a part of for 50 years. She had been forced to make a flimsy, vague excuse to her friends about a sudden change of plans for Mark's big party. The rumors that followed were far more damaging than any loud scandal would have been. There was no clear enemy to rail against, no dramatic story to spin where she was the victim. There was only an inexplicable loss of influence at her favorite haunt, a quiet social demotion that was as confusing to her friends as it was humiliating for her. Her carefully constructed image wasn't shattered. It was simply tarnished by a mystery she could never explain. A few weeks after the phone call, Mark came to see me. He came alone on a Wednesday afternoon, and it was the first of many such visits. We sat in my kitchen and he apologized. It wasn't a rushed or defensive apology, but a sincere and humbled one. He took full responsibility for his passivity, for allowing his wife's anxieties to dictate how he treated his own mother. Our relationship began to heal slowly over those Wednesday lunches built on a new foundation of honesty. For Alyssa, the path was different. Stripped of her primary social stage, she was left with little choice but to confront the hollowness of her ambitions. Her journey forward was a much quieter one, a forced introspection, now that the audience she was performing for had been dismissed. As for me, I thrived. I took the reins of Beacon Hill commercial properties with a vigor that surprised even myself. I discovered a sharp business acumen I never knew I had, a skill honed by years of managing a household budget and seeing Frank handle his affairs. I found a profound new purpose in managing my late husband's legacy, not as a passive inheritor, but as an active and engaged leader. The work was energizing. It filled my days with challenges and decisions, and it connected me to the city and to my husband's memory in a way I'd never expected. I wasn't just a widow or a grandmother anymore. I was a businesswoman. Months later, on a warm September evening, I hosted my own 73rd birthday party. I booked the entire patio at Le Ciel. It was filled with my true friends, women I'd known for decades, and a few of my new appreciative business associates, including Mr. Davies. Janet, the manager, personally brought out a beautiful cake, her smile genuine and warm. At a small four-top table near the back sat Mark, Alyssa, and my grandchildren. They were invited, and they had come. Alyssa was quiet, observant, and impeccably polite. There was no performance, only a subdued respect. As my friends sang and I leaned forward to blow out the candles, I caught Alyssa's eye across the patio. There was no triumph in my gaze, no gloating. There was only a calm, quiet authority. In that moment, I knew I had done more than win a battle. I had reclaimed my family not by force or by anger, but by quietly and irrevocably rewriting the terms of their lease on my respect. In the end, Patricia's victory wasn't loud. It wasn't a bitter screaming match, but a quiet, calculated move that spoke louder than any argument ever could. She came to understand that her daughter-in-law's cruelty wasn't born from simple malice, but from a deep, pathetic fear of not measuring up in a world obsessed with appearances. But learning the reason for a wound doesn't excuse the scar it leaves. Sometimes the most powerful lessons in respect come not from a confrontation, but from the calm, quiet click of a lock on a door someone wrongly assumed they owned.